as opposed to a well-oiled machine or like a factory, our context is complex, not complicated. Our organizations are in fact complex systems with all of their internal variables that evolve within complex systems. So we're in a complex system inside a complex system. But you're thinking like, this has always been the case, right? Our ancestors, they had the same problem, right? The previous generation or 2-3 generations ago. Industry leaders from like 50 years ago also had to deal with the same issue. Not exactly. What's actually changed, and I know you know this, but what's truly changed is the rate at which these variables are adapting. They used to grow a little bit linearly, and now they seem to be growing exponentially. The way they change, they evolve, disappear, and reappear. The number of variables and the rate of change has actually never been so high. And again, I know you know this. It's been repeated again and again. Things are moving faster and faster. So software is literally eating the world. Bits are eating atoms. And while at the same time, access to the internet and to computing power has never been higher. We've had more technological developments related to IT, to information technology in the past, let's say, 50 years than humanity has had in the hundreds or thousands of years that preceded it. Focused on bits rather than on atoms, right? We still don't have those flying cars, but they're coming. And with all of this progress, innovation, developments, everything should be much better, right? A utopia of productivity increases, wealth, increasing more value for shareholders, for stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it turns out that's actually not the case. So a few things. Social mobility is slower than expected. We have less high-earning taxpayers. We're creating less high-earning taxpayers. Income inequality seems to keep rising. There's fewer consumers to drive our economy. That's what it means, essentially, from a purely capitalistic point of view, when you have less more income inequality. The ROA, or the real value created by investment, has been declining for businesses. Because you might think, the shareholders are reaping all of the benefits, but even that's not true. So the real value created by investment, call it ROA, has been declining since 1965 and continues to decline today. And you might think it's only a handful of companies that are benefiting from this, but even the upper quartile of companies, like the winners, quote unquote, have only slightly increased the rate of return to their shareholders. Meanwhile, like the lower quartile, firms are destroying shareholder value at a faster rate. Now, why is this happening? And of course, as we mentioned, in a complex system, there is not one reason, one single cause. But a bag of these reasons, a bag of these variables, they fall under the same label. So when the Industrial Revolution turned into the ICT revolution, the information revolution, and software began to eat the world, many of us have forgotten to unlearn and relearn new ways of thinking. Not all of us, but many of us. And we can, however, adopt a new way of approaching these issues. We can attempt to unlearn models of our old paradigm and adopt new ones. So what do I actually mean by, and a lot of these are still taught in business school, by the way, the old approaches. So what do I mean by unlearning, right? Which I've mentioned like twice. That the idea of unlearning is the notion that in order to grow, to learn, to adapt, one must first undo some of our habits and ways of thinking. And I promise you it's not easy, it's quite uncomfortable, but it leads to failure at first. And that's why it's uncomfortable. The hard part is not the learning, but it's actually the unlearning, the walking back down the mountain a little bit. Because if you keep climbing on the same path, you might be taking the wrong route. I would even argue that the necessary rate of unlearning nowadays is higher than it's ever been before. What the heck do I mean? Show me some examples. What are you talking about? Well, for example, it was once thought that the world was flat. We unlearned that. Or most of us, at least, unlearned that. It was once thought that rain came from the gods. We also, unlearned that. I see some in the present. It was once thought that all work needs to take place together in an office. We've been unlearning, learning to unlearn that recently. That decisions should be based on sheer brilliance, experience, and charisma. The days of the madmen, we're also unlearning that. It was once thought that degrees were a must-have to hire skilled knowledge workers. Some of us are unlearning that, or that humans are expenses that need to be managed in order to reach shareholder goals. Whereas now we learn that, humans might actually be an asset, the heir of human capital to be invested in and cherished. Today, I'd like to achieve unlearning on this point, that Companies, organizations, people's teams are complicated systems that need to be commanded and controlled, but rather that companies are complex systems. And within complex systems, they require learning to dance with the complexity, learning to dance with the uncertainty. They require managing uncertainty. The faster you learn and adapt, the more ahead of the curve you are, and the faster you'll be ready for the next paradigm shifts. I don't know what they are. In the future, we might have to unlearn that people spend most of their money in the analog world versus the digital world, that machines are incapable of emotional intelligence, that we're a single planet species, or that death is irreversible, for example. But for today, let's stick to the managing uncertainty. So, some examples, as Aaron Dignan points out in Brave New Work, this hasn't changed for 100 years, or at least for 98% of companies. Most org charts, this one pulled from General Motors 100 years ago, most org charts inherited the biases and the mental models of the industrial era. What about the role of a leader? Once seen as a role requiring confidence, charisma, definite answers, it's becoming much more a role that requires humility, the ability to admit that, I don't know. That one doesn't know, and most importantly, where we are responsible for orchestrating and creating the right context, rituals, an environment that will allow our teams to navigate uncertainty, managing uncertainty.